Hi everyone, in this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at pawn endgames, and to be more specific about mined squares. Now, what exactly is a mined square? A mined square is a square that if a certain side steps on first, then essentially they lose the game. Now, what am I talking about? Let's say that we have this exact position, and we see that both sides have equal material, and also both sides have a passed pawn. White having a passed pawn on b5, and black having a passed pawn on c5. Now, the thing is about this position that unfortunately it's a draw. Why is it a draw? Well, let's take a look at it. Let's say that white tries to approach via king to c4. Then black can easily win by playing the move king to b6. And the reason is because now white has moved onto a mined square. And in this specific case, I will just highlight the mined squares. They are c4 and b6. b6 for black and c4 by white. So we're going to be using these two squares to illustrate the principle of a mined square. So if white plays king to c4, then black is going to go king to b6. Another square that you could technically consider a mined square for both sides is technically a4 and d6, and you'll see why in a moment. So if white tries king c4, then black will just go king b6. And here white has basically nothing. He can't push the pawn, he can't push this pawn, so essentially he has to leave the defense of this b5 pawn. He could go king c3, king d5, king d3, but wherever he goes, he loses this pawn, and it's an easy win for black. Just king b3, and you already know how to win this. Let's say that you try another move, and you instead go king to a4. Well, if you do this, then it's a pretty similar idea, just king to b6, and there's no way of stopping king takes b5 from happening. Just king b3, king takes b5. The pawn is advancing, and there's no way to stop it. Now, let's have the same position, but instead of white to move, it's black to move. So, if it's black to move in this position, then black cannot step on these two squares, d6 and b6. Why? Because if he does it, then white is just going to go king to c4. And black has stepped on a mined square. And after the king moves to c7, just you capture the c5 pawn, and there's really nothing that black can do. And it's the same thing if black goes to the d6 square. He's just going to get king c4 from white. And now black must move somewhere where he does not defend the pawn on c5 anymore. So that means that black cannot move there. So how are both sides going to create a draw when you cannot really advance the king forward? Well, the thing is, you just need to keep on shuffling the king between all of these squares on the 7th rank. b7, d7, a7, maybe even e7, and whoever basically steps on a mined square first is going to be the one who loses the game. So what they have to do is they have to play king b7 and now king c3. Just avoid stepping on either b6 or d6. You could just shuffle between c7 and b7 or even c7 and d7. But point being, there's really no way to win this anymore. So you just have to keep shuffling back and forth, and essentially it's a draw. So let's look at a couple of more positions where mined squares are available. Okay, so now we have a new position, and before we start to see how to deal with a mined square, I'd like you to first point out what the mined squares are. So I'll give you some time to think about it. Okay, so the mined squares in this position for both sides are e6 and c5. e6 is for white and c5 is for black. So why are these mined squares? Well, let's say that white to move. White plays the move king to e6. Now, black can go king to c5. And unfortunately for white, he has nowhere he can go to defend both the d5 pawn and make a legal move with his king. So he must play something like king to f6, and now you just capture on d5, and it's an easy winning game just by pushing this pawn to victory. So what should white play? Well, white should go around the pawn and take the long way to do this. So white should play king to f6. And here, black has two moves, king to b5 and king to c7. And king to c5 essentially leads into a similar position that both of these two lead to. So if king to c7 is played, then just king to e7. And after king c8, king takes d6. If you remember from my key square video, white has now occupied one of the key squares, and the d5 pawn can easily be pushed now. Let's just say king d8, king c6, king c8, d6, and now it's already won for white. So what is the other option that black has? The other option is to play the move king to b5, but this allows king to e7. And yet again, white should not step on the e6 square because it's a mined square. If he steps on it, he's basically done for. So he's going to go this way, king e7, attack the pawn from this angle. King goes to c5, and only once the king goes to c5 and he hits that mined square, now only does white play king to e6, and black is in Zugzwang. He has nothing he can do, and he's going to lose the pawn on d6. Now, let's try that same position, but it is black to move. So if I make it black to move, how is black going to do this? Well, black cannot play king to c5 like I mentioned, because c5 is a mined square. So then what does black do? Well, black should actually just play the move king to b5. And now it seems like it's going to end up in a similar variation that happened to white. So in this position, white should most likely play the move king to e4. Not king to f6, because there's actually the option of just playing the move king to c4 as black. And now, let's say king to e6, just king to c5 is enough to win. So after king to e4 is played, black goes king to c4. And now king to e3, king takes d5, king to d3. And the difference between why this position was actually a draw for black, but it's a win when white does it, is because of the position of the pawns. If you notice here, white's pawn is a bit farther than black's, meaning that the corresponding squares are closer to where white's king is eventually going to capture the pawn. But if you consider the position where black does this, black's king is not occupying any of the corresponding squares that this pawn could use, because the pawn is very far back, and really there's no way of doing this. So let's say you go king c5, king c3. If you go d5, then like I mentioned, if you put the king and pawn on the same rank, then you can't make any progress. d4, king d2, king c4, just no progress at all. So it's a different story when it's black to move. Black is able to get a draw if he is to move. But if it's white, then it's a completely different story just because of the position of the pawns. Let's look at 3 more positions. So in this position, it's black to play. Now, we have to first identify the mined squares here. So you'll understand the mined squares in a second. So here black will play king to b7. And now white goes king to b3. First of all, we have to identify why doesn't black just go king to a7. And it's because if black goes king to a7, then white's just going to go around, just play king to b3, go around and try to capture the pawn this way. So king to b3, and then the maneuver that we're going to see in this variation also does work. So after king to b7, white's going to go king to b3. King to a5 doesn't work because there's king to a7 and you don't make any progress as white. So king to b3, and now king to a6. Black tries to approach the pawn, or at least get the king a bit more activated. King to b4, and now king to b7. And here is where we identify that the 2 mined squares for both sides are b5 for black and d4 by white. And meaning that whoever steps on these squares first will obviously lose. So let's see how white outflanks his opponent. So white will play king to c4, and black will go king to a6. And here, if white goes back to b4 now, then just king to b7 and the position will repeat. So what does white do? Well, white will play king to d3. And he's trying to get around via e4, e5, d6, something like that. So black will try king to a5. And now Sackman decided to play the move king to e4, because now if the king goes to a4 here, just king to e5, and there's no way to stop king d6 and winning the pawn. If you go here, then just king d6. There's no way to stop the pawn from being lost. So king b5, but now king d4. And after king a4, king e5, There's just no way of black saving the position. Black must capture the pawn. Otherwise, after king b5, just king d6 is easily winning. So, just king takes a3 is forced, and now king d6. And you also have to know that if black tries king a5, then white can go king d6. Because if black ever tries king to b5 now, then white just plays a4 check. He uses this pawn as a decoy, and after king takes a4, king takes c6, king to a5, let's say, king to b7, white's going to queen with no problem whatsoever. So let's look at two examples where this occurs in a real-life game. This next position occurred in a game played between Alexander Alekhine and Frederick Yates from the 1910 Hamburg tournament. Now, here it's Alekhine to move, and Alekhine is up a pawn, but there's one problem. The pawns are doubled, and black's king is actually very close to the pawn on e5, which means that if black manages to capture the e5 pawn, and then somehow advance his f-pawn by capturing the other e-pawn, then white could be in a bit of trouble. So Alekhine played the one of two moves that actually wins the game. And I encourage you to pause the video and find out what those two moves are. Okay, so the two moves that you can play are king to d3 and e4. And we'll look at king to d3 first. And this was what Alekhine played. So Alekhine thought that here, if Yates were to play the move king to e6, then he just goes king to d4. And here's where we identify that the mind squares are both d4 and e6. So if Yates steps into the e6 square, then he's essentially done for. So that is why Yates played the move king to d7. But Alekhine is now not going to play king to d4, otherwise king e6, and he will actually lose the e5 pawn. And there's actually a separate variation we'll look at that shows that even if you do go for the whole exchange by playing king d4, king e6, king c5, you take those pawns and then you push your pawns. You have to contest against black's f-pawn. Even after all of that, it's theoretically a draw, and we'll see that in a moment. So after king to d7, e4 by white. If you do not play the move f4, then you're in trouble. Because if you capture on e4 with check, then just king takes e4 by white, and white has the advantage. Because after king to e6, just king to d4. And now once the king goes back, just king to d5. And you're going to capture b5 and a4, and black has essentially nothing he can do to prevent this. So if you capture the pawn, that fails. And if you play the move f4 here, then after king e2, king e6, here white can immediately win by playing king to f2. He's not going to play king to f3, because in that case, the mind squares would be f3 and e5. So now, white is actually playing the waiting game, and he's going to see if black is either going to capture the pawn, and then king f3, and then Alekhine would easily win this because the king would have to move and you capture the f4 pawn, or Yates could completely ignore the pawn on e5, but that would cost him this pawn as well. So after all of this, Yates would be down 2 pawns. They are doubled pawns, but it really doesn't matter. He's still down 2 pawns, and Alekhine can easily win this position with no effort. So that was king to d3. Now, e4 was the other winning move, but before we look at e4, we're going to look at 2 other moves. King to d4 and king to b4. If king to d4 is played, then black will just go king to e6, and like I mentioned before, mind squares are both e6 and d4. And unfortunately for white, white cannot play the move e4 because black can just simply ignore the pawn by playing f4. And this is the major problem in this variation. White is not exactly forcing black to capture the pawn. So after f4, this king is either forced to move, or you just give up a ton of material by playing b3, and then you allow all of these pawns to fall. So king c5, but black isn't even concerned about the pawns now. He just goes f3, king takes b5. He's even willing to give up all of his pawns just to get a queen, and black would be winning in that case. So the other option is to play king to b4, But here, king to e6 would be played. King takes b5, king takes e5, king takes a4, and if we try to analyze this position after king takes e3, b5, f4, b6, f3, b7, f2, and now b8 queen, f1 queen will be played, and it does seem like maybe white has a chance of winning this. All Alekhine really needs to do is just trade the queens off. But you'll see that is a hard task itself. Let's say queen to b6 check. You just play king to d2. Queen to b2 check. Trying to slowly approach the king. King to e3. There's really no way of making any progress. Let's say queen to c3 check. King to e4. Queen to b4 check. And black should just not step on the 5th rank. Otherwise queen b5 check. And you should not go to d3 or f3. So the only move that can be played is king to e3. You can't go king to d3 because queen b5 check just skewers the king to the queen. And if king to f3, then just queen to f8 check. And you trade the queens off and you easily promote the pawn. So king to e3, and essentially white has no way of making progress. And unfortunately for white, he must accept the draw or just get a perpetual check somehow. So that is the reason why those two moves don't work. So what happens if e4 is played? Well, now if e4 is played, then black goes f4, because capturing the pawn on e4 isn't the best idea when king d4 is available. You could try e3, but just king takes e3, and now you're already lost as black. So that is why f4 is more or less forced, and now just king to d3 by white. King to e6, and now king to e2. And yet again, we see that these squares are mined. Note that king d4 would be a humongous mistake after king to e7, because you're not really gaining anything as white. You're just going to have to go back and forth, and essentially it's going to be a draw. So instead, king to e2. And now, of course, if you capture the e5 pawn, like I mentioned before, e5 and f3 are mined squares. So if black captures on e5, then king to f3, white wins by zugzwang. So what does black do? Black must go back, king to f3, king to e6, and now king takes f4. White is yet again up 2 doubled pawns, but white can still win this game. So let's look at one more example game. This last game that we're going to be looking at was played between Kobis and Tu Huang Tai. And in this position, white is actually drawn, this position, completely. And there's actually no way that white can really make any progress until you see the mistake that happened. So here, white played the move bishop to d1 check. And after this, king to h4. And this was the ultimate blunder. Why? Because just moving the king to g6 was better. Just trying to play h5, g4, and try to trade the pawn off for the h3 pawn, and then simply just stop any ideas of white ever getting an advantage, because there are no pawns left, and it's just a king versus bishop endgame. It's an easy draw. So that would have been the better idea. However, king to h4. And after this was played, the game just completely changed. Here, bishop to g4, and here, h5. And the idea is pretty simple. If you move this bishop, then simply g4, and it's going to be a draw. After h takes g4, h takes g4, it's a pawn versus bishop endgame. It's equivalent to playing a king plus bishop versus king. So it's really a draw. So this would have been a draw unless white had this move king to f5. So white played king to f5, and after this, black is completely lost. H takes g4 was played because it's really the only move. Going king g3 would just allow king takes g5. So h takes g4, h takes g4, and now we see what the mined squares are. h4 and f5. And black was already occupying the square long ago. So when he's on this h4 square, now he is the first one to move, and he must give up the pawn on g5, and he's losing. You have to know that the move bishop to f5 doesn't exactly work here. The reason is because g4 by black. And black's idea is pretty simple. He's going to give up his pawn for either the opportunity to exchange all the pawns off the board, or after bishop takes g4 check, just play king g6. It's an easy draw, mainly because black can easily hide in the corner in the case that he loses his h6 pawn. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, you notice that the bishop that white has is a light squared bishop. But if white were to hypothetically somehow be able to advance his pawn all the way to h6, then you notice that the queening square is a dark square, but the bishop is a light squared bishop, meaning that this is a draw because you can never force the king out unless he stays in the vicinity of these four squares. So after king g6, white has really no way to make any progress, and black draws easily. The other option is that after g4 is played, if you go h takes g4, king g5, and there's simply no way of stopping the move h5, and whether you defend the pawn or not, or if you capture that pawn on h5, it's a draw for black, because he's going to exchange the pawns off and there's no way of stopping it. So that was the last position that we saw, and now I hope you get a better understanding about mind squares in chess. So I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comment section, and stay tuned for more chess.